Alright, so almost all of this chapter is now finished. The only thing left to study is called bone formation, right? So bone formation, we already sort of looked a brief introduction to bone formation when we studied the functions of osteoblasts. Osteoblasts, if you recall, they were densely stained cells, simple cuboidal layer cells present in the endosteum and the periosteum, and they were able to secrete bone matrix. So firstly, they would secrete what's called osteoid, which is soft or woven bone, and then that soft or woven bone was calcified, right? Calcified by calcification factors released by the osteoblasts, like the matrix vesicles containing phosphate ions and osteocalcin, which would bring in the calcium and everything, and calcium and phosphate would combine together to form calcium phosphate crystals, hydroxyapatite crystals. Before we officially begin the bone formation, let's just go over what we have learned about the bone structure. So firstly, there's woven bone, which was the soft bone, right? It was a non-calcified, non-lamellar bone, which contained lots and lots of type 1 collagen meshed around each other in a soft matrix. So the matrix would contain GAGs and glycoproteins and water and whatnot. And we've already learned that the woven bone is the first bone to appear in fracture repairs, and we'll look at the fact that it is also the first bone to appear in embryological development in something called the intramembranous ossification, as well as endochondral ossification. It is present in growth plate, right, in epiphysis. Like, for example, you have long bones, right, like the femur and the humerus are long bones, and they have growth plates in their epiphysis, and that growth plate actually contains woven bone and cartilage, and that cartilage increases in size to elongate that bone, to increase the length of that bone, and afterwards, when needed, it is also calcified to form long bones. A good example of this is femur, of course, which has the growth plate in the epiphysis, and it continues to grow until 18 to 22 years of age. So you'd say that a person grows in height until about 22 years of age for males. Similarly, moving on, we had the lamellar bone, right? If you recall, we have discussed the lamellar bone in very, very much detail. So we said that there's different types of layers, different types of lamellae. First of all, we had the outside lamellae, called the external circumferential lamellae. Then we had the circular lamellae forming the Haversian systems, the osteons, and we had some lamellae or layers of calcified matrix present among external circumferential and circular, which were called the interstitial lamellae. Okay, so the osteon and the Haversian system, we've looked at it in detail, and what it contained was a central canal called the Haversian canal, and they were all connected to each other by perforating canals. So the bone is connected sideways as well by perforating or Wilkman canals, and all the bone matrix contained some inactive cells that were derived from osteoblasts. Osteoblasts, after they were done with their synthetic activity, they would go ahead and differentiate into osteocytes, and osteocytes would be present inside their own lacunae inside the bone matrix, and they were all connected with each other through canaliculi. Canaliculi are small canals that contained gap junctions. Gap junctions, very, very important. There's only one cell type in bone tissue that contains gap junctions, and those are osteocytes, right? And that's pretty much it. So let's move on to osteogenesis, or bone formation. There's two types of bone formations. There's intramembranous ossification and there's endochondral ossification. Let's just discuss the number one first. We have intramembranous ossification, which only occurs inside the human embryo, in which what happens is that there's no cartilage involved, of course, and what happens is that there's embryonic mesenchymal stem cells, and they are present obviously around blood vessels, and when the embryo reaches the stage of bone formation, these mesenchymal stem cells relocate to places where the bone would be formed. And what they do is that when they relocate to those places, they differentiate and form pre-osteoblasts, and they form a primitive connective tissue containing pre-osteoblasts, and then those pre-osteoblasts differentiate to form osteoblasts, and then osteoblasts would secrete a primitive bone matrix, which would be obviously a soft bone initially, a woven bone, yeah? And there's no cartilage involved, no chondrocytes involved in all of this process. So in intramembranous ossification, it occurs in the embryo where embryonic mesenchymal stem cells relocate to places where bone would be formed, and they form a woven bone. And then after a while, that woven bone would be calcified through calcification factors and would eventually form the ossified bone. And that is intramembranous ossification. And the other type is endochondral ossification. Endochondral ossification. So the word chondral should give you an idea about cartilage being involved, because in the last chapter in which we studied cartilage, there were chondrocytes and chondroblasts. And so endochondral ossification would mean cartilage is involved. And this is a kind of ossification or production of bones which usually involves formation of long bones. Right? And we've already looked at a brief intro to it just a while ago, in which we said that there's growth plates present in the epiphysis, which contains soft cartilage. That cartilage increases in size and then helps elongate those bones. And one of the examples we looked at was the femur, and then after a while it is ossified when needed. So this is a diagram that I got from Junqueira's book, and here we have a fetal hyaline cartilage which develops and forms basically along the diaphysis first. It is ossified, and then after the diaphysis we have epiphysis that are being ossified, and then we have the formation of epiphyseal plates. So everything else would be ossified except the epiphyseal plates in bones of children. And then as the children would grow in age, their bones would elongate, they would grow in height, because the epiphyseal plates, the growth plates are, growth plate cells are dividing and elongating, and it occurs until about 22 years of age for males. So that's endochondral ossification, which occurs because there's cartilage present in the growth plates, and that cartilage would multiply, the cells of the cartilage would multiply, divide by mitosis, help in elongation of that bone, and then that cartilage would be ossified by ossification factors. So I have another diagram here to show you the two types of ossification. So we have over here any guesses what this one is? This is intramembranous ossification, right? And this one, which contains the chondrocytes, yeah, cartilage is involved. This is the endochondral ossification, right? Alright, so next up what we have is called bone remodeling and repair. There's something called bone turnover, which is basically the process of bone resorption and replacement of new bone in the same location, and there is almost no change in shape, and that is bone turnover. So resorption followed by bone secretion. That is greater in children, obviously because children are growing, and so on. There's also a very important phenomena called bone plasticity, and you should get an idea of what it is from the term bone plasticity, is that bones are actually plastic in nature. They can be molded, they can be remodeled, because they have these cells called osteocytes, which are able to detect the pressure and able to remodel the bone upon different stresses, right? And one of the examples we already looked at was the astronauts, that when the astronauts go in space, there's less stress placed upon the bones, and it results in more bone resorption, and so it results in lesser bone density, right? Another example of this is in orthodontics, when braces are placed on teeth, and teeth undergo this stress, and they sort of comply to that stress after a while, then the bone is resorbed and reformed, and so on. In bone repair, there's also a very important phenomena, that is that if periosteum is left in place of a broken bone, of a fractured bone, after it is surgically corrected, the periosteum which contains the osteoblast would be able to reform that bone in that particular location. So usually what happens is that when a patient gets fractures of bones and he goes to the orthopedic surgery, the surgeon, what he would do is that he would surgically correct that bone in position as it was and leave the periosteum in place, so on top of that bone, so that the osteoblasts of the periosteum can again reproduce that bone to where it was. Then we have the metabolic role of bone, which is basically bone can be used as a storage of calcium, and in low blood calcium levels, we can actually stimulate the bone's osteoclasts to release more calcium levels. We've already looked at how that happens with the parathyroid hormone and the calcitonin and so on. Joints, I think you study more in anatomy. There's different kinds of joints, like those that do not allow any movement, those that allow some movement, and those that allow free movement, like synovial joints and articular joints. So let's go ahead and look at some clinical correlates. Let's see if I missed any over here. No. Okay, so clinics, first of all, we have obviously rickets. Rickets is a very, very common disease, and it's a nutritional disease which results from vitamin D or calcium deficiency. And when these two things are deficient, vitamin D is important for calcium absorption, and calcium itself, when it is deficient, then it leads to decreased ossification, because obviously calcium, we need it for ossification. So it results in softer bones, and usually stress and weight on bones results in bending of bones, especially in children. And some of the most common bones that are bent in rickets, any guesses? Tibia and fibula. Okay. Similarly, we have growth hormone disorders, which so in growth hormone disorders, growth hormone can either be increased or decreased, right? So if in children it is increased, then it results in something called gigantism, in which there's abnormal growth in children. It results in a gigantic morphology. Similarly, in decreased growth hormone in children, we have what's called dwarfism. Usually pituitary dwarfism, which is because growth hormone is released by pituitary gland. We'll look at it in the endocrine signaling chapter. And similarly in adults, if there's increased growth hormone due to some pathology, then it results in increased bone density. Okay, this is a very common clinical correlate. It's called herniated disc or slipped disc. It's basically inside your spine. You might have studied in anatomy that the spinal vertebrae are actually linked together by vertebral discs that contain an outer fibrous cartilage called annulus fibrosus, right? And on the inside, it has this soft part which is called nucleus pulposus. And usually due to age progression and due to heavy weight lifting, we have what's called degradation or degeneration of the annulus fibrosus. And when it degrades or degenerates, it results in herniating of the content that is present inside the vertebral disc. And that herniation can occasionally press on nerves, and usually occurs in the lumbar region where the sciatic nerve fibers are passing through. So it may press on those nerve fibers and cause a very common pain called sciatic pain. It radiates from your lumbar region all the way down to your legs. This pain is called sciatic pain, also called sciatica. Similarly, we have rheumatoid arthritis. Rheumatoid arthritis is basically the inflammation of synovial membrane. When a synovial membrane, which is present inside the synovial joints, results in release of matrix metalloproteinases, which actually digest or degrade the collagen of articular cartilage, and it exposes the bone, right? So the articular cartilage is gone, the bones are in contact with each other, and when the bones are in contact with each other during joint movement, then there's more pain. It's called joint pain, rheumatoid arthritis. And actually this is also progressive, because the more pain arises, the more inflammation occurs, and the more inflammation, the more MMPs are actually released, and it sort of intensifies the condition.